Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a fascinating and, honestly, kind of alarming environmental detective story. We're looking at a ubiquitous, completely invisible threat that has shaped modern industry, triggered massive global panics, and hides right in plain sight. We're talking about benzene. Stick with me because the science we're unpacking today is absolutely going to change how you look at your everyday environment.
Let's kick things off with a number that literally shook the global beverage industry: 160 million. Back in 1990, the famous mineral water brand Perrier had to recall 160 million bottles worldwide. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of that. And the craziest part, it wasn't because of a misprinted label or a bad batch of plastic. It was due to contamination by a chemical most consumers had never even heard of. This massive event was a huge wake-up call, alerting governments and the public to a very real, very invisible risk.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The 1990 mineral water panic. 2. Meet benzene, the invisible threat. 3. Sources in air and food. 4. Impact on blood and immunity. And 5. Regulating a known carcinogen. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The 1990 Mineral Water Panic.
Now, Perrier wasn't just some isolated fluke. The 90s were actually full of these contamination alarms. Right after that colossal 160 million bottle recall, late 1990s saw Koala Springs voluntarily pull their fruit-flavored water in Florida, and the dominoes kept falling. Fast forward to June 1998, and the British Soft Drinks Association had to report widespread benzene contamination to the UK government, which triggered yet another wave of recalls. So what was the actual culprit here? Turns out, industrial carbon dioxide, the exact stuff used to add the fizz to carbonated drinks, is produced by combustion and naturally contains benzene. If it isn't strictly purified before use, well, that benzene goes straight into the bottle.
Section 2. Meet benzene, the invisible threat.
What's really wild about benzene is the sheer simplicity of its structure. The molecular formula is just C6H6. It's a highly flammable, aromatic hydrocarbon boiling at 80.1 degrees Celsius, and it actually occurs naturally in crude petroleum at concentrations up to 4 grams per liter. But here's the kicker. Because it's so incredibly volatile, it is highly mobile in our environment. It evaporates in a flash and mixes perfectly with most organic solvents. It's literally everywhere, acting as a ubiquitous environmental contaminant formed from both natural processes and human activities.
So why do we care so much about this simple little ring of carbon and hydrogen? Well, benzene is heavily used in industry to make everything from plastics to petrol additives. But more importantly, benzene is a proven human carcinogen. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies it as Group 1. There is no maybe or suspected here. The evidence is undeniable. Exposure to benzene causes cancer in humans. That definitively raises the stakes of our investigation.
Section 3. Sources in air and food.
When we actually map out our daily intake, a pretty surprising reality emerges. If you were panicking about those water recalls we just talked about, this should actually ease your mind a bit. Our dietary intake of benzene accounts for less than 3 micrograms per day. That is less than 1% of our overall exposure. The real culprits? The air we breathe. Ambient air, especially if you live in a city or an industrial area, hits you with about 200 micrograms a day. But the absolute biggest spike comes from cigarette smoke. It heavily dominates benzene exposure. An average smoker inhales an insane 800 to 1800 micrograms of benzene every single day.
Now, even though our dietary intake is super low compared to air and smoking, the specific places benzene shows up in our food are honestly pretty wild. The FDA did a study on everyday foods and found detectable levels of benzene in almost all of them. We're talking trace amounts here, measured in parts per billion, or ppb. But check this out. Cooked ground beef had up to 190 ppb. Cola sat at 138 ppb. Raw bananas at 132 ppb. Even a side of coleslaw clocked in at 102 ppb. It's just naturally found in many plant-derived foods. Plus, traces can sometimes migrate from polystyrene packaging or even form from certain added preservatives under the right conditions.
Section 4. Impact on blood and immunity.
So what happens when it gets inside us? It sets off a very specific physiological chain reaction. Step 1. Benzene is almost completely absorbed whether you breathe it in or eat it. Step 2. Because it's lipophilic, meaning it absolutely loves fat, it rapidly spreads throughout the body, targeting the liver, kidney, brain, and fatty tissues. Step 3 is where things take a turn. It heads to the liver where it gets metabolized by an enzyme called cytochrome P450. And finally, step 4. Those newly formed metabolites travel directly to the bone marrow. And that is exactly where benzene does its most severe damage.
Because it specifically targets the bone marrow, our blood and immune systems take the direct hit. In fact, damage to the blood, or hematotoxicity, and the immune system are the absolute most sensitive indicators of benzene poisoning. Chronic exposure causes bone marrow depression. That shows up as cytopenia, which is a scary drop in the number of mature blood cells. It causes anemia, and ultimately, as we mentioned with that Group 1 carcinogen classification, it leads to leukemia. The evidence linking occupational benzene exposure and leukemia in humans is highly conclusive.
Section 5. Regulating a known carcinogen.
Since benzene is literally everywhere, from crude oil to the air in our cities, we can't entirely eliminate it. But we definitely can and do strictly regulate it, especially in our drinking water. The World Health Organization maintains a strict guideline value of 10 micrograms per liter. That specific limit is calculated to keep the excess lifetime cancer risk to just 1 in 100,000. Meanwhile, the US EPA sets an even stricter maximum contaminant level of 5 micrograms per liter. Other regulatory bodies like the EU and Health Canada go even further, capping it down to just 1 microgram per liter. These tight numbers are essentially the invisible shields protecting our public health.
Which brings us to our final thought. Benzene isn't just an industrial byproduct. It is a naturally occurring chemical that's in our air, and yeah, even in our bananas. So how do we balance the immense benefits of living in a highly industrialized world with the absolute necessity of managing these invisible, naturally occurring threats? It takes constant vigilance, rigorous science, and strict regulatory standards, just like the ones we explored today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and I'll catch you next time as we break down another fascinating topic.